It was another one of those nights where I felt like I was running on fumes. The clock had struck 4 a.m. as I finally drove my way back home, the first light of dawn barely cutting through the fog. My body was sore from a double shift, a heavy reminder of the life I had chosen as an EMT. I hadn't even planned on coming home this early, but a cancelled call had given me an unexpected break, and all I could think about was falling face first into bed. When I unlocked the front door, everything was silent. That wasn't unusual. Laura always slept like a rock. I walked down the hallway, my feet barely dragging, my mind in a fog. As I opened our bedroom door, I immediately knew something was wrong. There, in the dim light of the early morning, lay my wife Laura, tangled up with another man in our bed. My heart dropped, and for a split second, I felt like I was out of my own body, watching from above. Laura's eyes snapped open, and I saw a flash of terror cross her face as she looked at me, but it was her lover who caught my attention next. He just lay there, smirking at me, like he owned the place. Something snapped in me then. I didn't even think, I just acted. I launched myself at him, fists swinging. But he was quick, too quick. Before I knew it, I was the one pinned down, his face inches from mine, taunting me. That was when I noticed a strange tattoo on his arm, a pattern that seemed familiar but elusive. Rage took over, and in a blind surge of adrenaline, I broke free, grabbing the metal lamp from the nightstand and swinging it with all my might. The room went silent as he crumpled to the floor, blood pooling beneath him. I looked at Laura, who was shaking, half hidden under the sheets, her face pale as a ghost. I knew right then and there that nothing would ever be the same. The life I had worked for, the marriage I thought I had, it was all shattered in an instant. My hands were still trembling as I looked down at the man lying unconscious on the floor. Blood trickled from a gash on his forehead, spreading onto the carpet like some dark, twisted inkblot. For a moment, I thought about what would happen if he didn't wake up. Maybe it would be simpler that way, I thought. One less problem to deal with. But then I heard a groan. The bastard was coming to, and his eyes fluttered open, locking onto mine with a look that was more defiant than scared. He pushed himself up on one elbow, his smirk somehow intact, as if he hadn't just been hit with a metal lamp. I felt another surge of anger, the kind that blots out everything else. "What the hell are you doing in my house?" I demanded, my voice barely more than a growl. He didn't answer, just gave a half-hearted chuckle, wiping the blood from his brow as if it was nothing. That tattoo on his arm caught my eye again. It was a coiled snake, surrounded by strange symbols, and it stirred something in me, a faint recognition I couldn't place. I realized then that this wasn't just some random guy. He was something else, something worse. Without thinking, I lunged at him again, but this time, he was ready. He grabbed my arm, twisting it painfully, and I was forced to my knees. I could feel his breath on my face as he leaned in close, his voice dripping with arrogance. "You think you're the only one who's tough," he sneered. "You don't even know who you're dealing with." He released me with a shove, and I stumbled back, landing hard against the bed. I could see Laura out of the corner of my eye, cowering in the sheets, looking more afraid of me than of him. That was the breaking point. I reached for anything within arm's length and found a broken picture frame on the nightstand. In one swift motion, I smashed it across his face, sending shards of glass everywhere. He staggered back, clutching his face, and I took the opportunity to shove him down hard, feeling the rage pulse through my veins. "Get out of my house." "Now," I spat, each word filled with a venom I didn't even know I had. Finally, he seemed to realize that he'd lost this round. He gathered himself up, wiping the blood from his face, and gave me one last look, a look I'd never forget. It was the kind of look that promises more to come, the kind that tells you this isn't over. With one last glance at Laura, he turned and walked out, leaving me standing there, breathing hard, surrounded by shattered glass and broken memories. I looked at Laura, waiting for her to say something, anything, to explain herself. But she just sat there, her face blank, offering no apology, no excuse. In that moment, I knew that whatever we'd had was over. I didn't even know who she was anymore, and worse, I wasn't sure if I knew who I was, either. Not long after the man left, I stood alone in that ruined room, shards of glass scattered around, my heart pounding in my chest. I thought about packing a bag and getting out of there, at least for the night. But before I could make a move, there was a loud banging on the front door, followed by voices shouting my name. I recognized the voices as those of police officers. Within minutes, I was being handcuffed and led out of my own house. I barely had time to register what was happening before they shoved me into the back of a squad car. Laura was nowhere to be seen, and I couldn't decide if I was relieved or furious that she wasn't there to witness the spectacle. At the station, they sat me down in an interrogation room, a cold, grey box with a steel table and a single flickering light overhead. My head was still spinning, but I knew enough to realize that I was in serious trouble. After what felt like hours, a detective finally came in. He had a hard face and the kind of eyes that seemed like they'd seen more than their share of human failure. "Alex Wilkes," he began, flipping through a file with my name on it. "Do you know why you're here?" I glared at him, saying nothing. The less I said, the better, I figured. But then he slid a piece of paper across the table. I scanned it, and the words hit me like a punch to the gut. Assault with intent to cause grievous bodily harm. Aggravated assault. They were charging me with felony assault, and it didn't take long to figure out why. Martin, the guy I'd just beaten up, wasn't just anyone, he was a lawyer, and a powerful one at that. I'd seen the name before but couldn't quite place it until now. "What's going on here?" "He was in my house, with my wife," I managed to choke out, fighting to keep my voice steady. The detective didn't seem to care. According to him, he was invited. "Says you attacked him without provocation. Seems your wife is backing his story, too." He paused, letting the words sink in. "You've got quite the mess on your hands, Mr. Wilkes. Assaulting a man like him, well, it's not going to go well for you." My blood ran cold. Laura was backing him up? I felt a new wave of anger, betrayal cutting deeper than I thought possible. It was like she was killing me twice, once with her betrayal, and now with this. I wanted to scream, to throw the table, to somehow force them all to see the truth, but I knew it wouldn't matter. They'd already made up their minds. The detective leaned back, folding his arms. "You got anything to say? Now's the time." I took a deep breath, forcing myself to stay calm. "Yeah," I said quietly, the rage simmering under my words. "He's lying. I came home early and found him in my house, in my bed, with my wife. If anyone's a victim here, it's me." The detective just shook his head, clearly unimpressed. "You'll get your day in court." But I wouldn't hold out too much hope. They left me there for hours, alone, with nothing but the cold metal of the chair and the hollow ache of betrayal to keep me company. I knew this was just the beginning of a long, dark road, but I also knew one thing for sure: if they thought they could break me, they were wrong. I had lost almost everything, but there was still a part of me that wanted to fight. And I would. The day of the trial arrived faster than I could have imagined, though time felt like it dragged on as I waited in my cell, running through every moment of that night over and over again. When they finally called my name, I stood up, adjusting the ill-fitting suit they had given me, and prepared to face the courtroom. I'd been to courtrooms before, usually as an EMT, giving testimony in cases where a quick response had saved a life, or sometimes, tragically, where it hadn't. But standing there as the accused, my stomach knotted with anxiety, was a different world altogether. I scanned the room, finding Laura sitting in the gallery, her face an unreadable mask. A part of me wanted to reach out to her, to make her see reason, but I knew better now. She wasn't the woman I thought she was. And any hope I'd held onto was gone. When Martin took the stand, his performance was something to behold. He painted a vivid picture of an unhinged, violent man who had ambushed him without warning. He spoke in a calm, measured tone, expertly manipulating the jury with the same arrogance that had filled our bedroom that night. The whole time, he never even looked at me, as if I were beneath his notice. My lawyer tried to push back, to argue that I had been provoked, that I'd simply acted out of a moment of extreme shock. But Martin was prepared. He had evidence lined up, photos of his injuries, carefully constructed statements, and even a witness, one of his neighbors who claimed to have heard a violent outburst. I didn't stand a chance. The final blow came when Laura took the stand. She hesitated at first, her eyes meeting mine for a brief second before she turned away, recounting the events in a cold, detached voice that twisted the knife deeper. The judge barely took any time to deliberate. He ruled that I was guilty of aggravated assault and sentenced me to 3 years in prison. As the words left his lips, I felt a numbness take over. My life as I knew it was over. I had no house, no job, no wife. The future I had worked for was now nothing more than ashes. They led me out of the courtroom, past Laura, who didn't even look my way. My hands were cuffed, and the reality of my situation settled heavily on my shoulders. I was alone, more alone than I'd ever been. I'd spent my life saving people, helping strangers, putting myself on the line. But now, standing there with my dignity stripped away, I wondered if any of it had ever mattered. And so, they took me back to my cell, where I'd have 3 long years to think about all the things I'd lost, everything I'd once held dear, gone in an instant. But as I lay on the hard cot that night, something inside me stirred. I wasn't finished yet. They had taken everything from me, but there was one thing left they couldn't touch, and my will to fight back. The first days in prison were a haze of cold stares and silent routines. I quickly learned the unspoken rules: don't show weakness, stay out of other people's business, and keep to yourself as much as possible. I kept my head down, moved through the day without drawing attention. It was survival mode, plain and simple. But on my 3rd day, I met Frank. He was my cellmate, a wiry older guy with sharp eyes and a rough voice that carried the weight of years inside. He told me he'd been a prosecutor once, before a corruption scandal had landed him here. He had that look about him, someone who had seen the best and worst sides of people. I didn't know what to make of him at first, but over time, his gruff exterior softened, and he seemed to take a strange kind of interest in me. One evening, as we sat on our bunks, Frank looked over at me and said, "I can tell you're not one of them." I wasn't sure what he meant, but he continued. "You got that look, like you've been hit by a truck and you're still trying to figure out what happened." He let out a dry chuckle. "You don't belong here, not like the others." I didn't reply right away, but he didn't seem to need an answer. Instead, he leaned back, crossing his arms. "You know, when I first got here, I thought I'd never make it. Thought I was done. But you learn a few things in a place like this. You learn how to look at things differently. And you," he pointed at me, "you got a raw deal. But there's ways to fight back, if you know where to look." I didn't believe him at first. It seemed impossible to think of justice, let alone revenge, when you're locked up like an animal. But Frank had this way of getting under my skin, making me think, making me wonder. Over the next few months, he started sharing stories, bits and pieces of cases he'd worked on, ways the system could be bent and twisted. He told me about appeals, about finding loopholes, about using connections, and every time he talked, I listened. Really listened. One night, he leaned in close, his eyes narrowed with a quiet intensity. "You've got to understand something, Alex. There are rules for people out there, and there are rules for people in here. But the truth is, the game's the same. It's all about leverage. If you want your life back, you've got to play the game. Think of it like surgery, you need precision, not brute force." His words hit home. For the first time since this nightmare began, I felt something other than despair. I felt a spark of hope, something small but fierce. I'd been a healer, someone who fixed people's broken bodies. But now, I was the one broken. And maybe, just maybe, I could use what Frank was teaching me to put myself back together. Frank and I became a strange kind of team. He would lay out legal strategies, theories on justice, even ways to manipulate the system to get what I wanted. I knew it was dangerous. Getting involved in anything Frank suggested meant risking more than I could afford to lose. But it was also the only path I saw that could lead me somewhere other than this cell. As he talked, I started forming a plan, a way to take back control over my life, to fight against the people who had taken everything from me. I'd entered prison a broken man, but now, with Frank's guidance, I was becoming something else. I was no longer just a victim. I was a man with a purpose, a plan, and the will to see it through. I knew there would be risks, but as I looked around that cell, surrounded by grey walls and razor wire, I realized there was nothing left to lose. The time for despair was over. It was time to fight back. The day I was released felt unreal, as if I were stepping out of a nightmare and into a world that had changed without me. The air outside the prison walls was sharp, cold, and tasted like freedom mixed with bitterness. I'd spent 3 long years inside, but I'd made those years count. Frank's lessons hadn't gone to waste, they were carved into my mind, fueling a singular purpose. Revenge. With a few bucks in my pocket and a head full of plans, I found a small, run-down house in a forgotten suburb. It wasn't much, but it was a start. I spent the first days adjusting, relearning what it was like to live freely. But the memories of that night, and the years that followed, were always there, lingering in the background, urging me forward. I knew exactly where I needed to go, and I knew who had to pay. I reached out to some of Frank's contacts, those he'd introduced me to before my release, people with experience in gathering information, in digging deep where others wouldn't dare to look. I needed to know everything about Martin, every crack in his perfect facade, every shadow he tried to hide. It didn't take long for them to come through. Martin had climbed the social ladder quickly, all thanks to his carefully crafted image as a successful attorney. But there was more than just law in his portfolio, and he had his hands in dirty investments, bribery, and even a few suspected connections to local crime. It was a web of deceit, and he was the spider in the middle. I couldn't help but feel a surge of grim satisfaction. He'd destroyed my life, but now I held the strings to his. My first move was simple: observe. I watched from a distance, following him to his office, to the high-end restaurants, and back to his fancy condo. He was careful, that much was obvious, but no one was careful enough. I started to see patterns, routines, and habits. It felt almost surgical, peeling back the layers, understanding what made him tick. Frank's words echoed in my mind, a precision, not brute force. I'd been an EMT once, someone who saved lives. But now, I was a man on a different mission, with a different set of skills. I was going to dismantle Martin's life piece by piece. The first strike would be financial. With the help of Frank's contacts, I got access to documents that hinted at money laundering through a shell company. The authorities would find it, but not before I'd made sure Martin knew it was my doing. I sent him an anonymous letter, just a single line typed out on plain paper: "You took everything from me. Now it's your turn." I imagined his face as he read it, his smug confidence cracking just a little. It was a small victory, but a start. I knew he'd be nervous, but I wanted him afraid. In those first few days after my release, I felt more alive than I had in years. I wasn't the same man who had gone to prison, broken and betrayed. I was something else now, someone who had been reforged in the fires of betrayal and loss. And with every step I took toward my goal, I felt a piece of myself coming back together. The game had begun, and I was prepared to see it through to the end. No more hesitation, no more doubts. I was coming for everything Martin held dear, and I was just getting started. As the days turned into weeks, I settled into a strange, solitary routine. My focus was razor-sharp, everything I did was aimed at dismantling Martin's life, one piece at a time. By now, I'd gathered enough intel on him to know exactly where to hit and when. I'd become a ghost in his world, slipping in and out unnoticed, collecting secrets he thought were buried too deep to be found. I'd taken on a new identity, an alias to mask my past and provide me with access to Martin's world. Posing as a freelance journalist, I moved easily in circles that knew him well, tapping into his network without anyone raising an eyebrow. I crafted a new persona for myself, someone believable, someone who could ask questions without suspicion. I dyed my hair, grew a beard, and altered my posture and speech patterns. It was almost too easy slipping into the role, like I'd been preparing for this my entire life without even knowing it. I started showing up at the same coffee shops, high-end gyms, and charity events that Martin frequented. With a little charm and a few carefully placed lies, I made connections with people in his circle. They were eager to talk about him, always willing to share stories of his so-called successes and his growing influence in the legal world. I feigned admiration, but all the while, I was filing away every scrap of information, every hint of weakness. It wasn't long before I discovered a new angle of attack. Martin had a taste for risky investments, some of which bordered on illegal. He was funneling money into offshore accounts, using shady brokers to cover his tracks. With Frank's contacts, I managed to get copies of his financial records, proof that could bring him down. I kept these close, knowing that they'd serve as the perfect weapon when the time came. One night, I found myself at a gala where Martin was a guest of honor. He was all smiles and charm, working the room with ease. I watched from the corner of the room, blending into the crowd, a glass of wine in my hand. I studied him, the way he carried himself, the fake sincerity in his laugh. But I also saw something else, a man who had grown too comfortable, too arrogant, someone who believed he was untouchable. It was this arrogance that would be his downfall. As the night wore on, I approached him, introducing myself under my new alias. He shook my hand, clueless that he was shaking hands with the man whose life he'd destroyed. We spoke for a few minutes, and I played my part well, nodding along to his stories, feigning interest. He didn't recognize me, and I knew he wouldn't. I'd transformed myself too thoroughly. But standing there, mere inches from him, I could feel the adrenaline coursing through me, the raw satisfaction of knowing that I was in control now, that he was walking right into my trap. After the gala, I followed him to a bar where he met with some of his colleagues. I stayed in the shadows, listening as he bragged about a big case he'd just won. He seemed invincible, laughing with his friends, unaware that his days of success were numbered. I watched him for a long time, memorizing every detail, every smug grin. He had no idea that the walls were closing in around him, that everything he valued was about to slip through his fingers. Back in my small, nondescript house, I reviewed my notes, piecing together the next step in my plan. The financial documents, the contacts I'd made, and Martin's own words would be enough to start the avalanche. The evidence was piling up, and soon it would all come crashing down on him. I'd spent 3 years in a cage, but now, I was the one setting the trap. For the first time in a long time, I felt a calmness settle over me. I wasn't afraid anymore. I knew what I had to do, and I was ready. The next phase would require precision, patience, and an unrelenting focus, but I had all the time in the world. Martin had made the mistake of underestimating me, of thinking I'd just fade away. But he was wrong. I was here, in the shadows, and I wasn't leaving until his empire crumbled. It had been months since my release, and I thought I'd gotten used to this new life of shadows and subterfuge. I was laser-focused on my goal, with Martin squarely in my sights. But one chilly afternoon, something happened that threw me completely off balance. I was sitting in a small, quiet cafe, going over some documents I'd managed to obtain from one of Martin's financial contacts. The place was nearly empty, just a few other patrons scattered around. I was lost in thought, absorbed in the web of numbers and connections, when a voice shattered my focus. "Alex?" I looked up and saw her. Laura. She looked different, thinner, worn out, like life had wrung her dry since the last time I'd seen her. She stood there, hesitating, as if she wasn't sure if she should run out or come closer. I was stunned, rooted to the spot, not sure if I wanted to talk to her or just walk away. But she sat down before I could decide. "Laura," I said, barely able to keep my voice steady. "What do you want?" She looked down at her hands, her fingers nervously twisting the strap of her purse. "I know I'm probably the last person you want to see," she started, her voice barely a whisper. "But I need to talk to you. It's about Martin." The anger I'd been carrying for years flared up immediately, and I clenched my fists, forcing myself to stay calm. "Martin? What could you possibly have to say that I'd want to hear?" She took a shaky breath and looked up at me, her eyes filled with something that resembled regret. "I know what I did was unforgivable, Alex. I don't expect you to forgive me. But I've lost everything because of him. He used me, just like he used everyone else. When he was done with me, he threw me away. I have nothing now, Alex. Nothing." I didn't feel sympathy for her, not yet, anyway. But I could see that she was broken, and that gave me an odd sense of satisfaction. At least she'd felt a fraction of the devastation I'd experienced. Still, I wasn't sure what she wanted from me, and I wasn't about to let her derail my plans. "So why come to me now?" I asked, my voice cold. "What could you possibly want?" She bit her lip, glancing around as if she was afraid someone would overhear. "I know things. About Martin. Things that could destroy him." She leaned in closer. "I want to help you bring him down. I have recordings, documents, evidence that he's been involved in things that would ruin him. I just need someone who can use them. I thought maybe we could work together." I leaned back, studying her, trying to gauge whether she was serious or if this was some new manipulation. But the desperation in her eyes was real. She wasn't here out of some altruistic desire to make things right. She was here because she had nothing left. She was desperate, and that made her dangerous, but it also made her useful. "What's in it for you, Laura? Why would you want to help me?" She swallowed, and for a moment, I thought I saw tears welling up in her eyes. "He took everything from me, Alex. Just like he took everything from you. And maybe I owe you this. I know I can never make up for what I did, but if I can help you bring him down, maybe it's something." I wanted to hate her, to tell her to leave and never come back. But there was something about her offer that was too valuable to pass up. If she really had evidence, if she knew things I didn't, it could be the final push I needed. Working with her was a risk, but revenge had its price, and I was willing to pay it. "All right," I said slowly, choosing my words carefully. "If you have what you say you do, we can work together. But don't think for a second that this erases anything. You and we're not friends. This is business. Strictly business." She nodded, the hint of a sad smile crossing her lips. "Understood." As she slid a small flash drive across the table, I felt the weight of it in my hand and knew that this was the beginning of the end. The final pieces were falling into place, and Martin's empire would soon be nothing but rubble. Laura and I were about to unleash a storm, and I could feel it brewing, electrifying the air around us. Laura's information was a goldmine. Over the next few weeks, I worked tirelessly, piecing together the damning evidence against Martin. The recordings she'd handed over were crystal clear, capturing his voice as he discussed laundering money and orchestrating backdoor deals. There were emails, too, long threads full of incriminating details, detailing his involvement in shady investments and outright fraud. He'd gotten sloppy, too sure of himself, and now I had enough to bring him down. I knew that simply handing this over to the authorities wouldn't be enough. Martin was deeply embedded in the system, with connections in every corner of the city. He'd wriggle out of anything I threw at him unless I hit him hard and fast, publicly, and from multiple angles. I needed this to be explosive, a scandal that would ruin him before he had a chance to retaliate. The first step was to leak the documents to the media. I reached out to a few reporters under the guise of my new identity. They'd be hungry for a story like this, especially one involving a high-profile attorney with a squeaky clean reputation. As soon as I delivered the initial wave of evidence, the story took on a life of its own. The media was relentless, picking apart every aspect of Martin's empire. It was everywhere, in newspapers, TV, and all over social media. Laura and I watched it unfold from a distance. I could tell that part of her was torn. She seemed relieved to be tearing him down, but there was a heaviness in her eyes. Maybe it was guilt, or maybe she was mourning the life she'd thought she'd build with him. I didn't ask. This was about vengeance, not healing. The next phase was the legal assault. With the public scandal ripping Martin's reputation apart, I contacted a few old acquaintances in law enforcement. They were more than willing to dig into Martin's activities now that he was under the media's harsh spotlight. Armed with Laura's evidence, they launched an official investigation. Charges started piling up: fraud, money laundering, and even conspiracy. He couldn't hide anymore, not with the world watching every move. Watching Martin's downfall was a strange satisfaction. I'd wanted this for years, and now it was unfolding just as I'd imagined. There was a deep satisfaction in knowing he was finally suffering, that he was now the one losing everything. He tried to deny it all at first, as I knew he would. But the evidence was too overwhelming, too damning to ignore. His confident facade began to crack, and I watched as he became a desperate man, scrambling to keep his empire from collapsing. One day, as I followed the news coverage from a dingy bar, the bartender turned up the volume on the TV, and I saw Martin's face splashed across the screen. He was being led away in handcuffs, his eyes hollow, his suit rumpled, his face a shadow of the arrogant man I'd confronted in my bedroom all those years ago. The sight filled me with a sense of closure, a satisfaction I hadn't felt since the night I found him with Laura. But the satisfaction was fleeting. As Martin was carted off to face the legal consequences of his actions, I realized that I'd reached the end of the road I'd been traveling for so long. The man who'd destroyed my life was finally paying the price, but I was left wondering what came next. I'd devoted myself to revenge, and now that I'd achieved it, I wasn't sure who I was without it. I looked over at Laura, who was staring at the TV screen, lost in her own thoughts. We were both tied to Martin's downfall, but we were also both freed from him, in a way. There was a strange, hollow feeling inside me, a mix of relief and something close to regret. We'd succeeded in our mission, but now we had to face what was left of ourselves. Now what? Laura asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I didn't have an answer for her. Not yet. But I knew that whatever came next, it would be on my terms. I was finally free from the past, and maybe, just maybe, it was time to figure out what a future looked like without revenge guiding my every step. With Martin behind bars, the world felt different. I had spent years pursuing this moment, but now that it was here, I felt like a man adrift, unmoored from the rage that had driven me. For so long, revenge had been my compass, but now that I'd finally arrived, I was left with a blank map, uncertain where to go next. The weeks following Martin's downfall were strange. Laura and I parted ways after that last night at the bar. There was no need to say goodbye, and we both knew that whatever had bound us together had served its purpose. She had her own journey ahead, and I had mine. She had given me what I needed, but the bridge between us was too damaged to rebuild. I returned to the little house I'd rented, feeling the quiet settle in around me like a shroud. For the first time in a long time, I didn't have to look over my shoulder. I was free, free from Martin, free from Laura, free from the endless cycle of resentment that had kept me captive. But I also felt an ache that I hadn't expected, an emptiness that revenge couldn't fill. I knew I couldn't go back to my old life as an EMT. Too much had changed, and I wasn't the same man who had dedicated himself to saving lives. But the desire to help others was still there, buried beneath the scars. I wanted to do something meaningful, something that could give me a new sense of purpose. I decided to start small, volunteering at a local clinic that provided medical care to those who couldn't afford it. It wasn't glamorous, but it felt good to be doing something that mattered. Slowly, I began to reconnect with the world around me. I made a few friends among the clinic staff, people who didn't know anything about my past or my revenge, who knew me simply as Alex, the guy who showed up and worked hard. It was a fresh start, one that allowed me to leave my old self behind, at least for a while. One afternoon, while helping a young man who had been injured in a fight, I realized something. Life goes on. Pain fades, scars heal, and the world keeps turning, indifferent to our personal tragedies. I looked at the young man, who was struggling with his own battles, and I recognized something of myself in him. I told him, "You can't let your past define you. Sometimes, you've got to let go and just keep moving forward." Those words hung in the air, and I felt like they were as much for me as they were for him. It was time to let go, to move past everything that had happened with Martin and Laura. They were chapters in my story, but they weren't the whole book. I had the power to write the rest of it, to shape it into something new, something better. Eventually, I decided to reach out to my daughter. We hadn't spoken much since the divorce, and she was grown now, living in another state, busy with her own life. But I knew I needed to mend that relationship, to rebuild the trust that had been shattered. She was hesitant at first, unsure if I'd changed, if I was still the same man she'd seen fall apart. But we started with small steps, phone calls and occasional visits, finding common ground and slowly piecing together the broken threads of our connection. In time, I found peace in this new life. It wasn't perfect, and there were days when the weight of everything still pressed down on me. But I knew I was finally moving in the right direction. Revenge had been a powerful fuel, but it wasn't the only way forward. I was learning that forgiveness, of myself, mostly, was the true path to freedom. As I looked back on the years that had led me here, I realized that Martin had only been a part of the journey. The real battle had been with myself, with the man I'd allowed myself to become in the face of betrayal. But now, I had the chance to rebuild, to find purpose beyond the pain, and to live for something more. It was time to write a new story, one that wasn't about revenge or loss, but about healing, about finding meaning, and maybe even happiness. I didn't know what lay ahead, but I was ready to find out.